My mother died in February of 2022. 11 months later, she sent me a letter. Not an old letter someone found in a box. Not a note she'd written before she died and arranged to be delivered later. This was a new letter. A fresh envelope with a recent postmark. It had traveled through the mail system like any other piece of correspondence, and it arrived almost a year after we buried her. The handwriting was hers. The words were hers. Even the tiny details were hers. The way she crossed certain letters. The way she started sentences. The little habits that become invisible when someone is alive but impossible to miss once they're gone. At first, I was grateful. I know how strange that sounds now, knowing where this story leads. But grief does strange things to people. When you've spent months wishing for one more conversation, one more phone call, one more ordinary moment, you stop asking questions when the impossible shows up at your door. You just hold it close. For 22 years, my mother called me every Sunday morning at exactly 9 o'clock. It didn't matter where I was. It didn't matter what I was doing. At 9 o'clock, the phone rang. Sometimes we talked about important things. Most of the time we didn't. We'd talk about the weather, the neighbors, a television show she'd watched, or something she'd cooked the night before. Looking back, those conversations seem insignificant. At the time, they felt ordinary. Now I'd give anything to have one more. Her name was Margaret. She grew up in the Appalachian foothills of Tennessee, in a place where people learned early that life rarely goes according to plan. She wasn't sentimental. She wasn't the kind of person who believed in signs or miracles or anything she couldn't explain. She believed in hard work. She believed in showing up. She believed that if someone needed help, you helped them. That was enough for her. But she also had a softer side that most people didn't see right away. Every Saturday morning, she made biscuits from scratch. Every spring, she planted a garden that somehow looked better than everyone else's. And she wrote letters. She wrote letters to cousins, old friends, neighbors, former coworkers, and anyone else she cared about. Long after everyone else had switched to emails and text messages, my mother was still sitting at her kitchen table with a pen in her hand. She said handwritten words felt more honest. I used to tease her about it. Now I keep every letter she ever sent me. When she got sick, everything happened quickly. The doctors diagnosed pneumonia. They sounded optimistic at first. We had 10 days between the diagnosis and the end. 10 days. 10 days of hospital rooms, exhausted conversations, false hope, and the constant feeling that if I just stayed positive enough, somehow things would turn around. They didn't. On a cold Thursday morning in February, my mother died. The world kept moving afterward. That's one of the hardest things about losing someone. The traffic still moves, the bills still arrive, people still go to work. Everything continues exactly as before, except one person is suddenly missing from it all. I went back home and tried to build a life around that absence. The hardest part wasn't the holidays. It wasn't her birthday. It wasn't even the funeral. The hardest part was Sunday morning. Every week, a few minutes before 9, I'd find myself looking at my phone. Not expecting it to ring. Just remembering that it used to. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in January of 2023. 13 months after her funeral. I almost missed it. There was nothing remarkable about the envelope at first glance. Just a plain white envelope mixed in with bills and advertisements. Then I saw the handwriting. I froze. For a moment, I genuinely forgot how to breathe. My address was written across the front in the exact handwriting I'd known my entire life. I turned the envelope over. No return address. Only a postmark from Wartburg, Tennessee. The name meant nothing to me. I had never been there. As far as I knew, neither had my mother. I stood beside the mailbox, staring at the envelope for almost a full minute before opening it. 100 explanations raced through my mind. A prank. A misunderstanding. An old letter was somehow delayed. Anything except the truth my eyes kept insisting on. The paper felt familiar. The handwriting felt familiar. And the first sentence hit me like a punch to the chest. Dearest, I hope this finds you well and that you've been eating properly. That was her. Exactly her. Not close. Not similar. Her. I sat down on the front steps and read every word. The letter was warm. Ordinary. Comforting. She asked about my work. She commented on the weather. She mentioned a book she'd been reading and thought I might enjoy. Nothing supernatural. Nothing frightening. Just a mother writing to her child. By the time I finished reading, tears were running down my face. I read it again. And then again, because for a few impossible minutes, it felt like she wasn't gone. Eventually, reason returned. There had to be an explanation. Someone must have copied old letters. Someone must have been trying to comfort me. Someone had to be behind it. I folded the pages carefully, placed them in a kitchen drawer, and told myself not to think about it anymore. For 3 weeks I managed exactly that. Then the second letter arrived, and that's when everything changed. The second letter arrived 3 weeks later. By then, I'd convinced myself there was a logical explanation for the first one. I wasn't sure what that explanation was, but I needed there to be one. The alternative was too absurd to consider. The envelope looked exactly like the first. Same white stationery, same handwriting, same postmark from Wartburg, Tennessee. And when I unfolded the pages, the greeting was exactly what I expected. Dearest, I hope this finds you well. For the first few paragraphs, everything felt normal. She talked about winter weather. She asked how work was going. She reminded me once again to take care of myself. Then I reached the third paragraph, and everything changed. She wrote, I know you've been having trouble sleeping. You always thought you hid it well, but you never did. Even when you were young, I could tell when something was keeping you awake. You'd become quieter, not sad exactly, just distant, as if part of you was somewhere else, trying to solve a problem nobody else could see. I think it's the nights that are hardest for you right now. The days stay busy. The nights don't. But whatever is waiting for you at 3 in the morning isn't as permanent as it feels. It will pass. I promise it will pass. I read the paragraph twice, then a third time. Then I put the letter down and stared at the kitchen wall. Because she was right. For nearly 3 months, I hadn't slept properly. Most nights, I was awake until 2 or 3 in the morning, sometimes later. I hadn't told anyone. Not my sister, not my friends, not my coworkers. No one. I carried it privately, assuming it would eventually get better on its own. Yet somehow, this letter described it perfectly. The detail that bothered me most wasn't that she knew I wasn't sleeping. It was the way she described it. The quiet. The distance. The feeling that part of me was somewhere else. Those weren't observations anyone could make from the outside. They were things I barely admitted to myself. I spent the next 2 weeks trying to explain it away. Maybe I had mentioned my sleep problems before she died. Maybe she'd noticed something years ago and written about it in advance. Maybe whoever was sending the letters had learned things about me somehow. Every explanation sounded weaker than the one before. And there was one problem I couldn't solve. The postmark. The letter had been mailed recently. Not months ago. Not years ago. Recently. A full year after her death. The third letter arrived before I'd found an answer. This one came near the end of February. By then, opening the mailbox had become a ritual. Every afternoon, part of me expected another envelope. Part of me dreaded finding one. The moment I saw her handwriting again, a strange mixture of excitement and fear settled into my chest. I carried the letter inside and sat at the kitchen table before opening it. The first page felt normal. Then I reached a single sentence that made my stomach tighten. She mentioned a decision I'd made at work. Not publicly, not in a meeting, not in an email. A private decision I'd made only a few days earlier. Something nobody outside my office could have known. I read the sentence 4 times. Then I went back to the first 2 letters. For hours I sat at my table comparing pages, reading line by line, looking for anything I'd missed. And eventually I found it. Small details, tiny observations, references that had seemed harmless the first time around. A comment about a conversation I'd recently had. A reference to something I'd been worrying about. A passing mention of an event that had happened only days before the letter arrived. The clues had been there from the beginning. I'd ignored them because grief made me want the letters to be real. Now I couldn't ignore them anymore. Whoever was writing these letters knew things they shouldn't know, and the more I examined them, the less it felt like someone pretending to be my mother. The voice was too accurate. The details were too personal. The warmth felt too genuine. For the first time, I found myself considering a possibility I'd been avoiding. Not accepting it. Just considering it. What if the impossible explanation was the correct one? What if my mother were somehow watching? The thought should have frightened me. Instead, it brought an unexpected comfort. Because if she was watching, then maybe she wasn't truly gone. Maybe death wasn't the wall I'd always believed it was. Maybe the connection between us had survived somehow. For a few days I allowed myself to believe that. Then the 4th letter arrived, and with it came something far more unsettling than impossible knowledge. A warning, a specific warning about something that hadn't happened yet. A warning that would change the way I looked at every letter that followed. The 4th letter arrived on a Monday morning in March. By then, I'd stopped pretending the letters weren't affecting me. Every day, I found myself thinking about them. Every night, I reread sections I'd already memorized. I still didn't know who was sending them. I still couldn't explain how they knew what they knew. But somewhere along the way, my fear had been replaced by curiosity. That changed the moment I opened the fourth letter. Something felt different immediately. The warmth was still there. The affection was still there. But beneath it was something else. Urgency. The casual observations were gone. The stories about books were gone. The familiar comfort I'd come to expect had been replaced by a tone I hadn't heard from my mother since the last days of my father's illness. The tone she used when something mattered. About halfway down the first page, she wrote, "I need you to do something for me. On Thursday, take the long way. I know you have a drive planned through the hills, and I need you to avoid the usual route. I can't tell you why. Maybe nothing will happen. Maybe everything will be fine. But the long way feels right, and I trust that feeling. Please, take the long way." I read it twice. Then a third time. Thursday was only 4 days away. And she was right. I did have a drive planned. A 2-hour trip through the hills of eastern Tennessee for an interview I'd scheduled weeks earlier. Normally, I would have laughed off a warning like that. But these weren't normal circumstances. Not anymore. The letters had already known things they couldn't possibly know. And whether I wanted to admit it or not, part of me trusted them. Thursday arrived. I left early that morning. At the first major turnoff, I hesitated. The shorter route was familiar. The longer route would add nearly 40 minutes to the drive. For a few seconds, I sat at the intersection arguing with myself. Then I turned onto the longer road. The entire trip felt ridiculous. I kept wondering what I was doing. Wondering why I was letting a letter influence my decisions. Wondering if grief had finally pushed me into believing things I normally wouldn't. Nothing happened that day. The drive was uneventful. The interview went well. I returned home feeling slightly embarrassed. Maybe I'd made too much of it. Maybe the warning meant nothing at all. 2 days later, I learned there had been a major accident on the route I normally would have taken. A storm had knocked a large tree across a narrow stretch of road. Several vehicles collided. Multiple people were injured. When I heard the approximate time of the accident, I felt cold all over. Because if I'd taken my usual route, I would have been there. Not hours earlier, not hours later. Within minutes, I sat alone in my kitchen that evening, staring at the fourth letter. For the first time, I wasn't asking how the letters existed. I was asking what they knew. The fifth letter arrived 3 weeks later, and somehow, it was even harder to explain. This time, there was no warning, no dramatic prediction. Just a brief mention of a conversation I hadn't had yet. A conversation with a specific person, regarding a specific decision. The details seemed oddly precise. Too precise. I remember reading it and thinking that if the conversation happened at all, it would probably go very differently. 4 days later, I found myself sitting across from the exact person she'd mentioned. Within moments, I realized I was hearing the same words I'd already read in the letter. The same concerns. The same questions. Even the same conclusion. I knew where the conversation was headed before it happened, and it unfolded exactly as she'd described. That should have frightened me. Instead, it left me feeling numb. Because each new letter pushed the boundaries a little farther. Each one chipped away at the explanations I'd been clinging to. Soon after that came the sixth letter. It contained only a brief warning. My sister was going to call. The news would sound bad at first. I needed to let her finish before reacting. That was all. No details. No explanation. Just a simple instruction. The following Tuesday, my phone rang. My sister. The moment I heard her voice, I remembered the letter. The news sounded terrible at first. My heart immediately dropped. But I forced myself to stay quiet. I let her finish. And by the end of the conversation, I understood exactly what my mother had meant. The situation wasn't bad at all. In fact, it was good news wrapped in frightening language. Without the letter, I would have interrupted her before she reached the important part. For several minutes after hanging up, I simply sat there, thinking, trying to understand what was happening, trying to decide whether I even wanted to understand. By the time the seventh letter arrived, something inside me had changed. I was no longer searching for rational explanations. I wasn't researching postmarks. I wasn't comparing handwriting samples. I wasn't trying to catch whoever might be behind it. Those questions still existed, but they no longer felt important. What mattered was the next letter, and the one after that, because somewhere along the way, I had developed a habit that frightened me more than any prediction ever could. I had started waiting for them, not just checking the mailbox. Waiting, looking forward to them, depending on them. Every envelope felt like a conversation that should have been impossible. Every letter felt like hearing my mother's voice again. And whether it was wise or not, I couldn't stop reading. I couldn't stop hoping another one would come. I didn't know it then, but the next letter would change everything. Because up until that point, the letters had only predicted events. The next one would do something different. The next one would issue a warning. Not about an accident, not about a phone call, not about a decision. A warning about a person. A person who was already watching my house. The 8th letter arrived on a Friday morning. By then, receiving a letter from my dead mother had become part of my life. That realization alone should have terrified me. Instead, it felt normal. That's the strange thing about human beings. We can adapt to almost anything if it happens slowly enough. What once seemed impossible had gradually become routine. Every few weeks, an envelope appeared. Every few weeks, I heard her voice again. Every few weeks, she told me something I wasn't supposed to know yet. But the moment I opened the 8th letter, I knew this one was different. The warmth was still there. The affection was still there. Yet underneath it was something else. Fear. Not my fear. Hers. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and unfolded the pages. The opening lines were familiar. Then I reached the warning, and suddenly the room felt colder. She wrote, "I need you to listen carefully. There is a man who has been watching your house. I don't know who he is. I don't know what he wants. But I know he's been standing near the end of your driveway in the evenings. Eventually, he will come to the door. When he does, don't open it, no matter what he says. No matter what reason he gives. No matter what he tells you about me. Do not open that door." I stopped reading. For several seconds, I simply stared at the page. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was ridiculous. A man watching my house? A stranger appearing at my door? It sounded like something from a bad horror movie. I folded the letter and set it aside. Then I walked to the front window. The driveway stretched toward the road exactly as it always had. Empty, quiet, nothing unusual. No stranger, no watcher, no mystery, just sunlight and an empty road. I remember shaking my head and telling myself I'd finally reached the limit of what I was willing to believe. Predictions were one thing. This was different. This felt paranoid. That night, before going to bed, I checked the window again. The driveway was still empty. The following evening, I checked once more. Nothing. By Sunday, I was beginning to forget about the warning altogether. Then Tuesday came. I returned home shortly after 7 o'clock. The sun had almost disappeared. Long shadows stretched across the yard as I turned into the driveway. And that's when I saw him. A man standing near the road, perfectly still, watching the house. For a moment, I thought it might be a neighbor. Someone is waiting for help. Someone lost. But as my car rolled closer, I realized something felt wrong. He wasn't waving. He wasn't approaching. He wasn't doing anything. He was simply standing there. Motionless. Watching. I slowed the car. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. The closer I got, the stranger it felt. People don't stand that still. Not normally. Even when waiting, people shift their weight. They check their phones. They look around. This man did none of those things. He stood exactly where he was, like he'd been standing there for a very long time. I stopped the car near the garage and watched him through the windshield. Seconds passed. Then a minute. Then 2. The man never moved. Finally, he turned. Without looking toward me again, he walked down the road and disappeared into the evening. Just like that. Gone. I sat there long after he disappeared. The engine is still running. My heart was beating faster than it should have been, because somewhere inside me, a terrible realization was beginning to form. The letter had been right. Again, I went inside and locked every door. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the house sounded different. Every shadow felt darker. Every passing car made me glance toward the window. And despite everything, I kept hearing the same sentence repeating in my head. When he comes to the door, don't open it. 3 days later, he did. Friday evening. Just after dark, I was reading in the living room when I heard 3 knocks. Slow. Measured. Deliberate. Not the hurried knock of a delivery driver. Not the uncertain knock of someone lost. The knock of someone who expected an answer. I froze. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. Then I remembered the letter. My stomach tightened. The knocks came again. 3 more. Patient. Almost polite. I stood in the hallway, staring at the front door. Part of me wanted to look through the peephole. Part of me wanted to ask who was there. Instead, I stayed exactly where I was. The silence that followed felt endless. Then came a 3rd set of knocks. And after that, nothing. No footsteps, no voice, no sound at all. 10 minutes later, I finally gathered enough courage to check the window. The porch was empty. The driveway was empty. The road beyond it was empty. Whoever had been there was gone. I don't know why, but that frightened me more than seeing him. The next letter arrived 2 days later. I opened it immediately. The first line stopped me cold. Good. You didn't open the door. I read the sentence again. And again. The letter continued. I knew you wouldn't. You were always the careful one. I'm not going to tell you who he was. I'm not going to tell you why he came. Knowing wouldn't help you. What matters is that he won't come back. That part is over now. You passed through it. I'm proud of you. The words should have comforted me. Instead, they left me with more questions than answers. Who was he? What did he want? Why had it mattered whether I answered the door? Most importantly, how did she know? The final paragraph was short. Only a few lines. Yet they unsettled me more than everything that came before. There is one more letter coming. I need you to be ready for it. One more letter. I read that sentence repeatedly, because something about it felt final. For nearly 2 years, the letters had appeared without warning. Now she was telling me the next one would be different. The last one. The final message. For days I carried that thought with me everywhere, and when the 10th letter finally arrived the following week, I understood immediately why she had wanted me prepared. Because the final letter wasn't about predictions. It wasn't about warnings. It wasn't about the future. It was about goodbye. The 10th letter arrived on a gray October morning. I knew what it was before I even picked it up. The handwriting. The familiar white envelope. The postmark from Wartburg, Tennessee. For nearly 2 years, those letters had become part of my life. They had comforted me, confused me, frightened me, and, more than once, protected me. But this time felt different. Not because of how the letter looked, because of what the 9th letter had said. One more letter. I need you to be ready for it. For almost a week, the envelope sat unopened on my kitchen table. I wish I could tell you I opened it immediately. I didn't. Part of me was afraid. Not of what it might say, of what it might mean. As long as the envelope remained sealed, there was still another letter waiting. There was still something ahead. A continuation. An unfinished conversation. The moment I opened it, that conversation might end. And I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. But eventually, curiosity overcame fear. One evening, just after sunset, I sat at the same kitchen table where I'd read every letter before it. I turned on the lamp, made a cup of coffee, and carefully opened the envelope. The greeting was familiar. Warm, gentle, comforting. The kind of greeting only a mother could write. I found myself smiling before I realized I was doing it. For a few moments, it felt like every other letter. Then I reached the second page, and everything changed. She wrote, "You're gonna tell this story someday." I stopped reading. Those words alone felt impossible. Not because of the prediction, because she understood me. My entire life I'd been the person who shared stories. The person who believed experiences mattered. The person who thought strange things deserved to be talked about, instead of hidden away. I kept reading. You've always believed that silence can sometimes be a kind of damage. You've always believed that if something changes the way a person sees the world, it deserves to be spoken aloud. You're right about that. Tell this story. Tell all of it, especially the parts that sound impossible. I sat back in my chair. The room was silent. Outside, darkness pressed against the windows. And for the first time since the letters began, I felt as though she wasn't simply describing events. She was speaking directly to me. The letter continued for several pages. Some parts I'll never share. Not because they're frightening, although some are. And not because they're secret, but because certain things belong to the people who receive them. Some conversations aren't meant for an audience. Some words are meant for only one person. What I can tell you is that much of the letter wasn't about the past. It was about the future. Not predictions, not warnings, guidance, simple reminders about life. About fear, about loss, about the way people carry grief long after everyone else thinks they've healed. Near the end, her tone changed. The words became softer, more personal, and somehow, that frightened me more than any prediction ever had, because I could feel the conversation approaching its end. Then I reached the final section. 3 short paragraphs. I've read them hundreds of times since. I know every word by heart. She wrote, "Don't be afraid of what's coming. Most people spend their lives fearing the wrong things. The truly important things rarely arrive loudly. They arrive quietly, Pay attention to the quiet things. I remember staring at those lines for a long time, because they sounded exactly like her. Not the mysterious version from the letters. The real version. The woman who raised me. The woman who always seemed to know what I needed to hear. Then came the next paragraph, the one that still stays with me. I'm not going away. Simple words, yet somehow they carried more weight than everything else. Not because they suggested ghosts, not because they suggested miracles, but because they spoke to something every grieving person understands. The fear that love disappears when someone dies. The fear that the connection ends. The fear that one day the memories become weaker than the loss. She was telling me not to fear that. And finally, the last paragraph. The last words she ever wrote. The letters will continue for as long as you need them. When you no longer need them, they will stop. And when they stop, that won't be a loss. It will mean you've learned what you were supposed to learn. Trust that. Then one final line. Just 5 words. I love you. Always. And beneath it, her signature. Not Margaret, not Mom, not Mother, Mama. I stared at that word for a very long time, because she hadn't signed a letter that way since I was a child. I was probably 8 years old the last time she'd used it, and somehow, that single word affected me more than the predictions. More than the warnings, more than the impossible knowledge spread across 10 letters. Mama, a word from a different lifetime, a word from before adulthood, before responsibilities, before loss, before funerals. A word that belonged to a version of me that still believed parents could fix everything. For the first time since the letters began, I cried. Not quietly. Not politely. I cried the way people cry when they've been carrying something heavy for far too long. And in that moment, I finally understood something. The letters had never been about proving the impossible. They had never been about life after death. They had never been about predictions, or warnings, or mysteries. They were about love. Every letter, every page, every word. Love reaching across distance, across grief, across whatever separates the living from the dead. That was the real message. Not that my mother could predict the future. Not that she could see things she shouldn't. But the bond between us hadn't disappeared. Somehow, in some way I still can't explain, it remained. It's been almost 3 years now, and there haven't been any more letters. Not one. At first, that hurt. I waited for them. Checked the mailbox. Looked for familiar handwriting. Nothing came. Then, slowly, I remembered what she had written. The letters will continue for as long as you need them. When you no longer need them, they'll stop. Maybe that's what happened. Maybe the letters ended because the lesson ended. Maybe the conversation was complete. Or maybe there's another explanation entirely. The truth is, I still don't know. I don't know who sent them. I don't know how they knew what they knew. I don't know why Wartburg, Tennessee kept appearing on every envelope. And after all this time, I've stopped trying to figure it out. Because some mysteries don't become less meaningful when they're solved. Some become less meaningful because they are. What I know is this. For 22 years, my mother called every Sunday morning to make sure I was okay. And after she was gone, something continued that work. Something kept watching. Something kept warning. Something kept reminding me that I wasn't alone. That's the most comforting thing I've ever experienced. Or the most terrifying. Even now, I'm not entirely sure which. But every Sunday morning at 9 o'clock, I still find myself looking at my phone. And every once in a while, when the house is quiet and the world feels far away, I could almost swear I hear it ring. Maybe that's why this story has stayed with me. I am Ryland Sawyer Hayes. Not because of the predictions, not because of the warnings, not even because of the mystery. It stayed with me because every person who's lost someone has asked the same question at least once. What if they're not completely gone? What if love leaves behind something more than memories? Something that lingers. Something that watches. Something that waits for the exact moment you need it most. I don't know if the letters came from my mother. I don't know if they came from somewhere else. And after all these years, I don't think the answer matters as much as it once did. Because when I needed guidance, it was there. When I needed comfort, it was there. And when I needed a reminder that I wasn't facing the future alone, it was there too. Maybe that's all any of us are really looking for. Not proof. Just reassurance. A sign that the people we love don't disappear as completely as we fear they do. Sometimes I still think about that man at the end of the driveway. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd opened the door. Sometimes I wonder if there were other warnings hidden between the lines that I never noticed. Questions like that never really leave you. But neither does hope. And if there's one thing these letters taught me, It's that the things worth paying attention to rarely arrive with noise. They arrive quietly. A memory, a feeling, a voice you haven't heard in years suddenly returns to you. Or maybe a letter in a mailbox that should never have existed. If you've ever experienced something you couldn't explain after losing someone you loved, I'd like to hear about it. Leave your story in the comments. Read someone else's story while you're there. You might be surprised how many people have experienced something similar. And if you enjoy true horror, strange mysteries, and stories that stay with you long after they're over, subscribe and join us for the next one. Until then, lock your doors, keep an eye on the quiet things, and if a letter arrives with familiar handwriting you haven't seen in years, you might want to read it carefully. There's one last thing I want to leave you with before this story ends. For a long time, I thought the mystery was the point. I thought the question was who sent the letters. I thought the question was how they knew what they knew. I thought the question was whether my mother had somehow found a way to reach across death and continue a conversation that should have ended in a hospital room in February of 2022. But the longer I've lived with this story, the less important those questions have become. Because the truth is, even if someone walked into my house tomorrow with a perfect explanation, I don't think it would change what the letters meant to me. Imagine that. Imagine finding out exactly how it happened. Imagine learning every secret behind every envelope, every prediction, every warning. Would it really matter? Maybe for a little while. Maybe it would satisfy the part of us that wants answers. But eventually we'd be left with the same thing we started with. The feeling. And that's the part nobody can explain away. The feeling of opening a letter and hearing the voice of someone you've lost. The feeling of being understood by someone who knew you better than anyone else ever could. The feeling that somewhere in this enormous, confusing world, you're still being looked after. That's what stayed with me, not the mystery. The feeling. People ask me if I still believe the letters came from my mother. And honestly, I don't know how to answer that anymore. Some days I think yes. Some days I think grief is capable of creating things we don't fully understand. Some days I think there are parts of life and death that we simply haven't figured out yet. And some days I think the answer doesn't matter nearly as much as the question itself. Because every one of us wants to believe the people we love don't simply vanish. Every one of us wants to believe that love leaves some kind of mark behind. Something that survives. Something that lingers. Something that remains when everything else is gone. Maybe that's why stories like this resonate with people. Not because they're scary, not because they're supernatural, but because they're hopeful. Hidden beneath all the mystery and uncertainty is a simple idea. That love might be stronger than absence. That connection might survive loss. That goodbye isn't always as final as it feels in the moment. I don't know if that's true. I only know what happened to me. I know that 10 letters arrived after my mother's death. I know they contain things they shouldn't have known. I know one of them may have saved me from an accident. I know another who warned me about a man who appeared exactly where she said he would. And I know the final letter arrived at a moment when I needed to hear those words more than anything else in the world. Maybe that's a coincidence. Maybe it isn't. You're free to decide that for yourself. As for me, I've stopped searching for proof. I've stopped trying to solve the puzzle. I've stopped wondering whether one day I'll discover the answer that makes everything fit together. Because some stories aren't meant to be solved. Some stories are meant to be remembered. And this is one of them. Even now, years later, I still keep the letters. They're stored safely in a wooden box on a shelf in my home. Every once in a while, usually on a quiet evening when the house feels a little too empty, I'll take them out and read them again. Not all of them. Just a page here. A paragraph there. Enough to hear her voice. Enough to remember. Enough to feel, for a few minutes, like the distance between then and now isn't quite so large. And every single time, I find myself returning to the same thought. Not about the predictions, not about the warnings, not about the impossible postmarks. About Sunday mornings. For 22 years, my mother called me every Sunday at 9 o'clock. She never missed one. Not once. And sometimes, when the world is quiet and the morning light is coming through the kitchen window just right, I still catch myself looking toward my phone. Not because I expect it to ring, but because part of me remembers what it felt like when it did. And maybe that's the real reason I told this story. Not to convince you of anything, not to prove anything. Just to remind you of something. If there's someone you love, call them. If there's someone you've been meaning to check on, do it. If there's someone whose voice brings you comfort, don't assume you'll always have another chance to hear it. Because one day, those ordinary moments become the things you miss the most. The phone calls. The conversations. The small reminders to eat properly and take care of yourself. The things that seem insignificant until they're gone. And if you're listening to this tonight while thinking about someone you've lost, I hope you're doing okay. I hope you're healing. And I hope that, in whatever way the universe allows, the people who loved you are still finding ways to remind you that you're not alone. Thank you for spending this time with me. And thank you for listening. Before I end this story, there's one detail I've never been able to explain. A few months ago, I took all 10 letters out of the box where I keep them. I laid them across my dining room table and started reading them in order, not looking for answers. Just remembering. And that's when I noticed something I somehow missed for years. The dates, not the postmarks. The dates mentioned inside the letters. Small references to days. Moments. Future events. Things I hadn't paid much attention to before. I started comparing them, one by one, and eventually I realized something that made my stomach drop. There was a pattern that shouldn't have existed, a pattern I still don't fully understand. Because according to those letters, there should have been 11, not 10. I checked the box again. 10 letters. I checked every envelope. 10 letters. I searched drawers, shelves, old folders, and everywhere I could think of. Nothing. No missing envelope. No explanation. Just a sequence that appears to end with something absent. Something that was supposed to arrive, and never did. Or maybe, something that hasn't arrived yet. I've spent a long time trying not to think about that possibility. Because if there really is an 11th letter, then one question remains. Who is it for? Me? Or someone else? And if it does arrive one day, what could be important enough to justify one final message? I don't know. Maybe I'll never know. But now and then, usually on quiet Sunday mornings, I catch myself looking toward the mailbox. Just in case the story isn't actually over. And maybe that's the part that still keeps me awake. Not the letters that came. The one that didn't. At least not yet. So now I want to ask you something. Have you ever experienced something after losing someone that you still can't explain? A dream that felt too real? A phone call at the wrong time? A voice? A sign? A coincidence that never felt like a coincidence? Tell me your story in the comments. I read everyone. And if enough people have experienced things like this, maybe we're all seeing pieces of something bigger. Something we're not supposed to understand yet. If you enjoy true horror, unexplained mysteries, and stories that stay with you long after the screen goes dark, subscribe and turn on notifications. Because next week, we're opening another case that never found a rational explanation. Until then, check your mailbox. Listen to the quiet things. And if someone you love has been gone for a long time, don't be too surprised if they find a way to remind you they're still around. This is Red State Horror. And it's me, Rylan, and I'll see you in the next story. Good night.